Well, thanks to all the contributors. I mean, there's just so much to think about, and we're covering so much ground. You know, your head would be spinning, quite honestly. But you see, this idea of targeted measures, I mean, it's a mantra that's being trotted out, but we need to sort of spell out what really that means, it seems to me, and I wouldn't mind hearing a little bit more what you think it means. You see, if targeted measures means lots of means-tested payments where we have a massive administration deciding thresholds and who's entitled to this and who's entitled to that, to me that's not a good way to do things, for example, right? Is that what we mean? Or if targeted measures means let's not give loads more money to corporations that are making absolutely super profits currently, because, you know, the interesting thing about this current crisis that is inflicting huge amounts of misery on ordinary families facing bills they can't pay, facing rents they can't pay, is that some people are doing very well. The economy is doing very well. Profits, the reason corporate tax receipts are up is because corporate profits are up at absolutely record levels. So some people are doing very well. So if we mean by targeted, don't give further handouts to already super profitable companies and already super rich people, I'm for targeted. But if targeted means that ordinary working people who are probably facing, if you take all the cost of living increases that we've seen over the last year or two, are probably in real terms €4,000–5,000 less well off than they were a year ago, and they've just got to suck it up, then I'm not for targeted, right? Because that would be unfair, and I also think economically damaging, right? Because and environmentally damaging. I mean, as somebody said to me in corridor today, when the demand for wood, for solid fuel wood is going up, you know, you're not very far away from people going out and starting to chop down trees. Seriously, that's not a joke. Chopping down trees to put fuel in their home, right? Which isn't very good for the environment. But that's where things go if people can't afford to heat their homes. So what do we mean by targeted? And isn't it the case that if ordinary working people and pensioners, you know, I believe pensioners and people on social welfare income have to, as an absolute minimum in this budget, get increases to the level of inflation, i.e. around 10%. I think anything less would be absolutely unconscionable, because, in other words, we are saying you're going to be poorer this year through no fault of your own. When the economy is growing and there's super profits being made, sorry, you've got to accept you're going to be poorer. Well, to me, that's just not acceptable. Now, so I just want to understand what you mean by being targeted in that regard. Are you saying that people just have to suck it up to some degree? Those sorts of people, the pensioners, the students, the ordinary workers, or by targeted, do you mean we shouldn't give handouts to those who are super profitable or super rich? Because I think unless we start to define what we mean by targeted, we're just kind of talking nonsense. And also then on the, you know, what we do with the corporate tax revenues, the bonanza of corporate tax revenues. And again, I just want to understand exactly what you're saying. You see, if we say we're vulnerable in that regard because we're dependent on a small number of companies, I agree. But we are facing an emergency, so it seems to me we have to use that revenue to address the emergency, to protect people, and to try and get us from an unsustainable situation to a sustainable one, including in the, you know, in the medium term, as you were referring to, Michael, to, you know, to have a sustainable economic plan. Now, is there anything wrong with saying we should be investing in areas that will sort of help people now, but also make us sustainable in the medium to long term. So, housing is an obvious one, right? The current housing crisis is draining current government revenue to a massive extent, about €1 billion a year. It would both help address an immediate crisis to put more money into building direct public and affordable housing, as well as make the public finances more sustainable in the medium to long term if we built more of our own housing stock. That's just one example. If, for example, given the fact that we have labour shortages and skills shortages all over the place, if we removed obstacles to people getting into further and higher education, that would be good now, and it would be good in the medium to long term. If we invested in forestry, sustainable form of forestry, not unsustainable forestry, but sustainable forestry, that would create employment. It would help, shore up the rural economy in a difficult situation, but it would also be a good long-term investment from an environmental. I mean, those are just 3 examples. Public transport, make it free. That's a cost of living measure. Helps now, but also it moves us in a positive direction from a sustainable environmental point of view, as well as building up our infrastructure if we spend more on public transport. So I just, could you maybe just comment on that? Is that a reasonable perspective, or, what do you... Yeah, you get my questions. Yeah.
So on the targeting, I think ESRI colleagues probably have a better view, but I think to be clear on targeting, the constraint is there's only a sort of certain amount of money the government can put into the economy without triggering inflation or without raising questions about fiscal sustainability. And so within that, the support should be targeted at those who need it most. Now, exactly how you define that is an inherently political choice that the Council doesn't have a view on. To be clear, we don't just mean targeting the very poor. It's probably support that could go more widely in the economy, but that's a political, how far and to whom is a political question that I won't get into. In terms of the corporation tax, I think as we were discussing with the Deputy O'Donnell, in a way the link isn't that mechanical, right? If we didn't have that money, we would also have scope to borrow if we wanted to. The question is that a good idea? And so really the question is, what's the right policy in terms of management of the cycle and not triggering higher inflation, and also with some view to fiscal sustainability. Now, as it happens, we've been talking a lot about temporary measures. Those can be financed either through borrowing or through the excess corporation tax, since we have it, but the amount of corporation tax we have doesn't determine what the right level of that. Of course, with permanent measures like raising welfare, like welfare rates or pensions, it would be a big mistake to finance that with corporation tax. These are permanent commitments. If the corporation tax weren't to be there, it would call those things into question. So I think that's important. And I think actually you raised a very good point at the end, and also one that I think is relevant to the points Deputy Doherty made. When we look at the medium term for the public finances, we've advocated for, we welcome the government's 5% spending rule, which is essentially should keep spending on the steady path in normal times to make sure the economy is properly balanced and maintains the public finances on a sustainable path. Now, we often highlight in that context over these major challenges like ageing and climate change that will have to be paid for. Those are things that are kind of going to happen, and we need to deal with them, and the government needs to plan about how it's going to deal with them, which it's not doing at the moment. But also, I think maybe we've been understating, and I think this is a good point to discuss it. There are many other needs in the economy, not things that we necessarily have, from a mechanical sense, have to deal with, like health, like housing, and whatever. But those things there, those are expectations that people have, they're challenges that society has, investing in skills and these kinds of things. And I think these are also areas the government needs to think about. And it ultimately does raise questions about what the government's spending priorities are and what level of tax will prevail. So I think that these are big questions. And I say we tend to focus on the things the government's going to have to pay for, like people getting older. But of course, there are lots of other things they maybe should be doing, but don't necessarily, aren't quite as mechanical maybe as the ageing costs or the climate change costs. But all these things do need to be thought about and need to be addressed. And some really difficult choices that will need to be made in the years ahead, I think, around these things.
Can I just ask one quick question, one brief additional question, genuinely quick question. If we were strictly following the original fiscal rules about fiscal space and all the rest of it, how much fiscal space would there be available in this budget? roughly?
Possible to answer because, I mean, so we've
Would
seen.
it be fair to say it'll be a lot more than you're allowing for in
It might
expenditure?
not. It might be less. The way the rules worked was so pro-cyclical that it could have risen to higher levels, but it's kind of a moot point. The rules are in suspension, right? So the spending rule that is in the EU fiscal rules that you're probably thinking of, that's not in operation this year. It wasn't in operation last year. Probably won't be there next year. If it was there, could we have done more? Well, it wouldn't be wise. I mean, what we're trying to say here is, and you'll remember this, Deputy, because you've heard us talk about this a lot, that we need to think about this in terms of like net spending. You know, if you want to do more on the spending side, that's fine, but it should be financed sustainably through higher taxes or other revenue sources. And that's kind of what we're saying here as well. Look, if you're going to add more fuel to the economy in a situation like this where you're very low unemployment at the moment, growth is still happening at a fairly fast pace, then you're going to add to the inflationary pressures that are there. Now, one way to prevent that fuel adding to those pressures is to take some of the heat out through raising taxes elsewhere.
Thanks very much.
Deputy Nash.